on a very special presentation. I'm really delighted to have Kristi Denby from BC Assembly of First Nations and Katisha Paul here with us. I'll do a formal introduction to our speakers today in a moment, and I just want to do a quick screen share to bring us together on the project that we're gathering around. So we're here as part of the Pacific North Shore and Sunshine Coast Climate Collaborative, which we have collectively renamed to Coastal Climate Resilience Collaborative. The project is generously funded by Natural Resource Canada. So I want to acknowledge our funders that enable us to come and be here together today. We've been doing a presentation series. This is another one of the opportunities for us to learn together about Indigenous values and First Nation climate action leadership. And this presentation is a part of the series that we're doing as a step towards our project progression. I want to arrive with you and say that I'm coming to you from the village of Chekwelp. This is a view from the top of one of the hillsides that the local folks will recognize, overlooking the coast that we are here to work on this resilience of together. I'm grateful at the abundance of nature that we have here and the strength of it that we feel within our communities every day, and looking forward to keeping it that way. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and put your name and affiliation and where you're calling in from if you'd like. I know that you're all coming from all various places across the region of our project. And the region of the collaborative is in the south coast of BC, and it's on the unceded ancestral territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Sechelt nations. ICLEI Canada, where I am employed by, I'm the project director for the collaborative and within ICLEI Canada. And we are here to facilitate the regional collaborative by engaging with staff from the nations and local governments and the regional districts, and bringing everybody together to progress collaboration on implementing climate resiliency together. The presentation today will provide an overview of the BC First Nations Climate Strategy and Action Plan and the ongoing implementation efforts led by the First Nations Leadership Council, the First Nations Climate Leadership Agenda, and the key outcomes of the Spiritual Knowledge Keepers Gathering on Climate Change. I had the privilege of being a witness and an observer at the Spiritual Knowledge Keepers Gathering, and it has really significantly influenced the path of my career and how I take climate resilience, my perspective on climate resilience. And so I hope that it will be meaningful for you as well as you listen today. We are in the phase 3 of our project timeline, still really in early days. We're going to be together until the end of December 2027. And we're in the planning stage of the prioritizing actions and identifying the action-specific plans that we're going to progress the implementation of together. So in phase 3, the activities that we do are to identify current and planned actions for resilience, look at practices from other regions, co-develop the list of adaptation actions for short-term and long-term implementation. And you've all been participating in that through the surveys and the workshops that we've been having together. And so today is the step of providing training activities to support the implementation as part of the series that we've been doing a lot of training together, and we'll continue to diversify that as well. Next, we'll be coming together at near the end of June and kind of forming groups to develop action-specific action plans throughout the next few months. I'm going to stop screen share here and introduce our speakers for today. Maybe Nilüfer, if you can help me by pinning Kristi and Katisha as I bring them on. We're very pleased to have Kristi Denby from BC Assembly of First Nations. She's a researcher, policy analyst, and sustainability professional with experience in water and land reform in South Africa, climate and environmental policy, and sustainable tourism and economic development. She has worked closely with Indigenous communities in Peru, Tanzania, South Africa, and Canada, integrating climate change, gender, and social justice into her work. Kristi holds an interdisciplinary Master's of Science in International Development Studies from the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. Since joining the BC Assembly of First Nation team in 2022, Kristi has played a pivotal role in advocating for First Nations rights, titles, and interests, particularly on climate and the environment. She works in close partnership with climate leads from the First Nations Leadership Council to implement the BC First Nations climate strategy and actions, in addition to co-leading key files and projects such as the BC First Nation Leadership Agenda, the BC First Nations Low Carbon Transportation Project, and the International Climate Adaptation Project, Building Climate Resilience from Indigenous Perspectives. She's currently living on the lands of the Northern Secwepemc people in Williams Lake, BC. She grew up in the beautiful territory of Okeskunuk First Nation in Windermere, BC, with strong family connections to Bogota, Colombia through her partner and daughter. Welcome, Kristi. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. We also have Katisha Paul presenting today. Katisha is also known as Kuchlushaus Little Angel. She's a Kulimuch Shaleni, a woman of this land with she, her pronouns. She's from the Startlip, Lilwat, and Silch nations living in Musqueam territory. She's a BC First Nations Justice Council policy analyst, the elected Union of BC Indian Chiefs Youth Representative, United Nations Global Indigenous Youth Caucus co-chair, and Urban Native Youth Association board member, and the BC Assembly of First Nations Climate Steering Committee member. Katisha is abundant. That's how I take this introduction as. In 2023, she was working with the Indigenous Youth Internship Program at the Ministry of Attorney General BC Public Service Agency in the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and the Union of BC CIC as a policy analyst. Kuchlaus advocates for the advancement of land, title, and human rights by implementing the action items of the Declaration Act Action Plan and sustaining Indigenous relations. Guided by the First Nations ways of being, seeing, and knowing, she holds a strong belief in the power of balance and equality. Delighted to have you with us, Katisha. I believe Kristi is doing the screen share for the presentation, and I will pin you each as you're speaking so that will support our recording.
All right, thank you. I'll maybe pass it off to Katisha to start us off, and maybe just give a bit of background or introduction to further what Ines added.
Of course. I'd scoil and the pizza piapor cook sauce station at zart lipstel im sunum silch heidsepka homoch misnimuch heidsepka it homoch the homite noiko I'd squallow and not some mistimuch. It's a good day out there, everybody, and I'm glad that we're sharing space here together with one heart and one mind. I'm Katisha Paul, also known as Kulksha Sauce, Little Angel, and Sepyapawit. I'm from the Tsartlip, Stalium, Swinomish, and Silch nations, and I am honored to be here. I'm thankful for the people of the land. I'm thankful for those who have traveled here. I am thankful for our Tamuch, our sacred lands. And I want to remind us all that in this work, those who are working together, we're good to one another. And as we move forward, paddling together, please remember these good feelings that we share with one heart and one mind. Kristi?
Thanks so much, Katisha. It's really lovely to be here today, and I just wanted to recognize everyone that made time out of their busy schedules to be here, and really looking forward to the presentation and discussion. So I guess we'll get started. Go ahead, Katisha.
Perfect. So here, as some of you may be aware, we have the First Nations Leadership Council in BC, and they have been brought together to bring awareness to First Nations issues to all levels of government and select organizations. They coordinate action, promote, and advocate for First Nations issues. They also bring First Nations representatives together to discuss important issues and take action together, as I said, with one heart and one mind. We have plenty of resources necessary to conduct research, share information, and participate effectively in provincial and federal political discussions. Next slide. And within the First Nations Leadership Council, we have three organizations: the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, the BC First Nations BC Assembly of First Nations, sorry, and the First Nations Summit. We have at the UBCIC, we started in 1969. That was still when my great-grandparents were alive, and it originated with the Indian Brotherhood and the Indian Sisterhood of BC. Their organization is meant to support multiple efforts, many land back efforts, standing on the front lines, supporting individuals, really going back to those grassroots to protect our title and rights and ensure that the Crown honors its obligations. At BCFN, they are a provincial territorial organization representing a section of the regional as mandated through the Assembly of First Nations, and they are advocating for Aboriginal title rights and treaty rights of First Nations here in BC. Along with BC AFN, there is also all other regions and territories that represent their respected areas geographically within AFN, and there are 12 regions, and they also have one national chief. The First Nations Summit represents those nations that are participating in the modern treaty negotiation processes or supporting those who are in the process. They are all together within the executives of those organizations. For myself, particularly, has been great to witness their teamwork and in face of items that we are going up against today politically with the Bill 14 and 15, these three organizations have really proven the strength of that cedar tree, holding up our backbone strong. And they are really the backbone of all of the work that we do and the advocacy for not only those that are here today, but for the future generations that are to come, while still uplifting and amplifying the voices of young leaders of today as well. Next slide.
Sorry, this is me. It's just hard to screen share and unmute myself. Anyways, well, thank you, Katisha. I'll just touch on some of the key sectoral areas with the FNLC, and one of them is climate action, the climate emergency. And also there's children and families. There's many different files that the FNLC is working on collectively, such as emergency management. There is actually a new FNLC website, so I'd invite you to check it out. And one of the key areas which I'll touch on is the climate emergency and the development of the climate strategy, and also the subsequent implementation that we're working on right now. And so the FNLC was mandated by chiefs and assembly to develop and implement the First Nations climate change strategy and action plan. And so this action plan really encourages First Nations from all regions of the province to put forward recommendations for climate action that align with First Nations values, worldviews, and priorities. So just an overview, as mentioned, we are mandated by chiefs from the various FNLC organizations to prepare the draft First Nations climate strategy and action plan in 2019. The strategy was endorsed in 2022, so a lot of the engagement was actually done throughout the pandemic, which made it tricky. But the need for the strategy really came out of the need for First Nations to reflect their needs, priorities, realities reflected in a strategy around responding to the climate emergency, because many of the provincial and federal strategies didn't adequately engage, or First Nations didn't feel their interests and realities and needs were fully articulated in the provincial or federal government strategies. So this document is a living document. It was endorsed in 2022. It is a large document. If you had a chance to look through it, there is a lot in there, a lot of detail. But there's also a lot of richness in that detail, which is great. And so it's also accompanied by an executive summary, 20 urgent calls for action. It's really, as I mentioned, comprehensive. It has a provincial-wide scope And it really respects the diversity and self-determination of First Nations, but also responds to the needs and priorities of First Nations in BC as a collective body. So what is the strategy? So the strategy, as I mentioned, is really a document filled with many, we'll outline the pathways, which are really important. Inherent title and rights is kind of at the center, capacity and leadership, land and water protection, and climate response and preparedness. And so the strategy aligns with the UN IPCC recommendations on GHG emissions. It seeks to address the climate crisis and its impacts on First Nations, and also to uplift First Nation climate leadership, and as I mentioned in the last slide, uphold self-determination, title rights, and treaty, and really strengthens First Nations climate leadership, but also to reduce vulnerabilities and respond to climate risks. And it was co-created with First Nations, grounded in First Nations knowledge, laws, and worldviews. So here is a diagram of kind of the vision at the center, which is we, the First Peoples of lands, assert our inherent title, rights, and jurisdiction to lead the response to the climate crisis. We exercise our knowledge, laws, processes, and our self-determined ways to care for the earth and ensure health and stability for future generations. So you'll see the guiding principles with the feathers around the center, and the inherent title and rights pathway is cross-cutting throughout all of the other pathways, which are capacity, leadership, the climate response and preparedness, and land and water protection. So I'll pass it over to Katisha.
So the BC First Nations Climate Leadership Agenda, we represent the 204 nations essentially within BC. And what that means is that we're really working on that distinctions based. We were able to have the 8 engagement sessions. In addition to that, we had more conversations through the Spiritual Knowledge Keepers gathering and various other one-on-ones. And that's strictly because you have to start a relationship early with our nations. And that was very clear through those engagements that we have to maintain and be consistent. And that means proper cooperation, consultation, and honoring of free, prior, informed consent, and also honoring the principles of OCAP. And that we as First Nations peoples, as title and rights holders, as the ones who are Hwamach meaning people of the land, hold the right to be consulted on all levels. The BCFN, for instance, as part of the First Nations Leadership Council, strongly advocates for First Nations in BC to be true partners with the provincial and federal governments, and even with the municipal governments as well, to tackle the climate emergency. The approach is consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and respectful of First Nations' inherent birthright to Aboriginal title rights and treaty rights. Next slide, please.
All right, just unmuting myself. We know that there's an urgent need for action. This was evidenced by the multiple climate-related disasters that have been happening in the province. Chiefs and Assembly declared a climate emergency as well in 2019. And, as you see, the 2023 was the worst wildfire year in BC's history. In 2024, BC continued to experience significant climate change impacts, particularly wildfires, floods, and droughts. And this has led to a huge economic cost as well. And so it's really essential that, there is a response to this, and it's First Nations. First Nations are really leading the way in many, many aspects. And, we'd like to center this work uplifting First Nations climate leadership, given their role as leaders in the response and adapting to climate change. So we know that this climate and biodiversity crises are really interconnected, and it's, really a dire threat to the survival, culture, and ways of life of First Nations, but all people for that matter. And we really know that the climate crisis is outpacing BC and Canada's ability to adapt. And so it's exponentially every year affecting First Nations and their territories and many other elements as well. There's also this inherent disconnect between colonial climate policy and First Nations worldviews as well. Oh, sorry, I'm back. So it was really important that we centered the First Nations climate leadership agenda on previous work. We really didn't want to replicate other work that has been done. There's been so much good work done in the province, and I'll just highlight a few, some of the work that we aim to build on in developing the First Nations climate leadership agenda. So obviously, I just covered the BC First Nations Climate Strategy and Action Plan, which was essential, excuse me, an essential building block for the First Nations Climate Leadership Agenda. And as Katisha mentioned and Inez, that we started this process off, the First Nations Climate Leadership Agenda, with which Katisha will touch on, was a First Nations Spiritual Knowledge Keepers gathering that was on climate change that was held in Tsleil-Waututh. And that was really responding to many requests by chiefs, leaderships, knowledge keepers, youth, saying that we need ceremony, we need healing, and we need to start doing things differently. And so we were able to bring together knowledge keepers and observers, and I'll leave it for Katisha to touch on that, but this was really a central piece of our work. There's a knowledge keepers mandate, which Katisha will go over, but this was really pivotal to kind of inform our work in developing the BC First Nations Climate Leadership Agenda. But there's also the Action Plan for Disaster Risk Reduction by First Nations in BC that was really also important. And some of the other documents was the First Nations Carbon Toolkit that was developed by BCFN and EcoTrust. The Joint Committee on Climate Action Best Practices Guide, that's the JCCA, it's a federal First Nations table. Indigenous Climate Action Network, Resiliency Climate Action Network, ARCAN, the First Nations Leadership Council Capacity and Needs Assessment, which we'll touch on later, and the BC Flood Strategy, and many other documents and strategies as well. So it's really about, as Katisha articulated here, paddling forward with one heart and one mind. And just knowing that this work is not done in isolation. I know it's been tricky. A lot of nations have felt that there's a lot of engagement happening and maybe little action. So it was essential to kind of reflect localized needs, priorities, realities, and elevate these to the federal level. It's because really the First Nations Climate Leadership Agenda is about federal policy, but of course we sit on provincial tables, and there was a lot of recommendations that were put forward as well on the provincial scale. So it's really creating this transformational change, and this was a commitment by the government in the Strengthened Climate Plan, the Emission Reduction Plan, and it was a commitment in the 2022 federal budget, which there was a commitment to create, as Katisha mentioned, distinctions-based, it's called the Indigenous climate leadership, but it was a distinctions-based approach, and very unique because we had an opportunity to work with First Nations leads across Canada, which is really, really interesting to share, to strengthen our work, and to build relationships at the federal level across Canada with First Nations regional leads. And so this BC First Nations Climate Leadership Agenda was also a commitment in the UN Declaration Action Plan federally. It's number 46. So this was the commitment by the government And we will get into kind of next steps further on in the presentation. But it really wasn't to replace the climate strategy, but rather complement and build. And really, the goal was to create policy recommendations and concrete recommendations to the federal government to really transform the federal system and how it's working and how to effectively uplift BC First Nations climate leadership and more broadly First Nations climate leadership at a federal level. And so we are the idea was to it was done under really tight timelines, and the idea was to create recommendations and have a final report, and this would feed into a memorandum to cabinet in Ottawa. So the government, it's a closed door process, which we were trying to advocate for changes that we could co-develop this memorandum to cabinet where decision makers at the federal level would review the memorandum to cabinet based on recommendations across Canada. And then this would go to Treasury Board to put budget to the implementation, which is essential. So unfortunately, due to the political uncertainty, many things happening in the last year in federally, we know that this process is really been stalled. So we are advocating for implementation. We're finalizing the report, the final graphic design, but we'll stay true and do our best to advocate to seek full implementation of this and seek the budget support that needed to implement these recommendations. Oh, pass it to Katisha.
There we go. Yes. So when we talk about sitting around in a circle and needing to build those relationships, it starts off with an invitation to say that the table is set. And that is exactly what Chief Darabob, or Cookbeat Darabob from Kakhet First Nations from the Statliam Territory did in September 2023, or for September 2023, rather. He had approached people in person and made sure to take those steps to travel and go to people's territory and meet people where they're at, whether they were already in ceremony at a powwow or if he was busy at another meeting, he would approach people and invite them while they're there as well. And that was a step further than sending a quick little text or a call out. It felt personal to many people, and it encouraged people to show up in this ceremony. And in collaboration with the BC Assembly of First Nations staff, we understood that in light of the escalating and devastating consequences of the dual climate and biodiversity crisis, both of which deeply affect our lands, waters, wildlife, and peoples, it was time for that ceremony. And as soon as it was decided, ceremony had begun. Alongside 23 spiritual knowledge keepers, 5 drummers, 5 dancers, and over 80 plus observers from provincial and federal governments, First Nations organizations, academics, and consulting firms were in attendance to witness this ceremony and to spend time in spiritual connections, storytelling, silence, prayers, tears, singing, drumming, laughter, and really the witnessing of those teachings and the passing on of that knowledge from our ancestors, our medicines, onto us who are breathing and living, walking, singing today, so that way we can strengthen those who are walking, singing, breathing tomorrow. The observers were invited into the space to build those relationships as an understanding of what First Nations governance, laws, and knowledge are by experiencing ceremony firsthand. They were asked and tasked with taking the messages and lessons back to their workspaces, their families, and their lives, and to share the dreams that the ancestors and the elders, chiefs, knowledge keepers have for this land, which is a shared vision for what this country could be. As humans, we have been given the gift of the voice on behalf of those beings who do not have one. It is all of our shared responsibility to carry that forward. When we talk about vision, as you had seen in the previous slides, a vision doesn't come from us as individuals. The vision is derived from the land, much as the same as the culture and our languages are derived from the land. We sit, we witness the ways in which the tides go in and out, and they are controlled by the moon, but we also witness that the flowers take in energy from the sun, and we use that to adapt ourselves to create solar energy. We witness what berries that the bears are eating and understand that some of them are poisonous. We are also witnessing now that in this moment of climate resilience, we have to understand climate adaptation, and the changing of seasons means that we can't control when spring, summer, fall, winter begin. It is the earth that is deciding that. And if we settle with that as a fact, there's going to be less climate anxiety. And that is what we learned throughout that spiritual knowledge keepers gathering, is that our earth, she has gone through many changes. Our prophecies tell us that we have already gone through the floods, the fires, the freezing, and right now we have to prepare ourselves for what is coming in the air. We also learn about vulnerability and the fact that us as human beings can't heal the land, because healed people heal people, meaning we have to heal ourselves first. We have to mend those relationships within ourselves and with others, and our relations with our relatives, who are those who are four-legged, fin, the winged, and those who are swaying in the wind. Next slide. So, as Kristi had mentioned earlier, a little bit of more on the BC First Nations leadership, BC First Nations climate leadership agenda process. In recognition of the climate emergency, BCFN, along with the UBCIC and the Chiefs in Assembly, they passed resolutions. Passed resolutions mandating the council committee to start, rather. The BC Steering Committee ensured that the accountability and oversight of engagement decisions, while explicitly recognizing the need to be directly informed by and responsive to First Nations title and rights holders, our priorities, our rights, and our knowledge. The BC Steering Committee is not a consultative body. First Nations governments, as rights and title holders to their lands, have specific protocols and laws that must be considered related to their climate change initiatives. We really focused on a regional approach. Within this process of creating the memorandum to cabinet, we held the leadership gatherings across the country. We also held technical gatherings, recognizing that it is a collective effort and it has to be done in full cooperation, coordination, and consultation with all nation members, whether that be young or old. There was many youth in attendance, which I had enjoyed, bringing in the provincial and government actors. Even within the spiritual knowledge keepers gathering was important to set those ground roots, to have them witness the way that we do our work, so that way moving forward, it was respected and also amalgamated into the formal processes of creating that memorandum to cabinet. Next slide.
Thanks, Katisha. And I'd just like to acknowledge Katisha's, all of the guidance and support that you've provided through the process. And our steering committee members were pivotal in this to kind of guide our team in doing this work in a good way and what that looks like. So I'd just like to acknowledge all of the steering committee members, which were made up of, knowledge keepers, youth, very diverse backgrounds, just a wonderful opportunity to work, with all the steering committee members. And I will put links in the chat with a lot of these documents and to provide more information on these different processes and strategies as well. So I'd just like to touch on briefly the engagement. We knew it was essential to have direct engagement with rights and title holders, and also, invite also community members to join leadership, matriarchs, knowledge keepers. You know, there was a variety of different people that attended, and it was a really meaningful experience. We hosted 8 regional in person, which was very crucial. Uh, Engagement sessions based on language groups. So we were in Prince George, Fort St. John, Kamloops, Cranbrook, Haida Gwaii, Terrace, Chilliwack, and Campbell River. So that was done from October. We started the first engagement was really the kickoff engagement session, and really to see what is co-development for First Nations in BC. What does that mean? So we do actually have quite an interesting report on what that looks like according to First Nations. And from that session, it was really clear that this process wasn't a co-development process, that there was too much misalignment, in particular with the memorandum to cabinet and the processes, and this misalignment with transparency and decision making and timelines. And so there was many, really interesting points as we kind of hear more of that language around co-development. What does that really mean? So we thought that was essential to start the process. Is this co-development? Is it not? What does that look like? What does co-development mean in this context? We also had a general and youth climate action survey. So we wanted to really, give people multiple options, First Nations multiple options, and really focus also on youth. I know youth really provided excellent feedback in both the BC First Nations Climate Strategy and Action Plan, but also the disaster risk reduction plan by First Nations as well. And so the survey was really aligned with the in-person regional engagements, and really the key ideas was to to bring people together as well in person, which is wonderful to kind of just provide the space. And we've heard that more over and over, that we need to continue to provide this space in person, and how important it is to build relationships as well, but also to, foster these discussions and identify key priorities, actions, and really concrete recommendations to advance and support First Nations-led climate action in BC. And so the outcomes of the engagement really were incorporated into our recommendations, priorities, policy direction that was submitted to the federal government and informed the memorandum to cabinet that was developed but never actually made it to the decision makers, unfortunately. So we also had many meetings, as Katisha mentioned. We did participate on the National Steering Committee. There was a meeting in Halifax, a leadership meeting in Ottawa. There was also another meeting in Vancouver, but we also met with First Nations organizations, networks, modern treaty nations. There was also a virtual update and engagement session. So really, it's important when engagement's done is to report back. We've heard it's very important to kind of report back and steer and seek that continual feedback. And so there was also an update presentation at the BCFN Assembly. We hosted a Chiefs and Leadership Engagement session on October 21st. And then just this spring, the FNCL agenda report and recommendations were formally endorsed by BCFN Chiefs and Assembly via Resolution 05/2025. So here's some pictures. We just want to acknowledge, all of the people that came out to give their time to contribute. It was really meaningful to us, and I think it really is reflected in the report and recommendations. And excuse me, that was our goal, is to really reflect what was said and what the priorities and recommendations were, and to put that kind of us as translators to put that on paper and see if we captured it correctly. So just really grateful for everyone that provided us feedback and guidance and input. It was absolutely essential to this process. So we know that this is a unique opportunity for action. There's been many changes, provincially and federally, in politics, with the economy as well, globally. There's different situations unfolding. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world, but we know that we need action. And with the UN declaration legislation adopted at the federal and provincial level, this really creates a unique opportunity for BC and Canada to really strategically align and cooperatively work together in partnership with First Nations. So, what we heard at the sessions was we want action, we want implementation. We are very much tired of continuing to talk about this. We want action, and we we really heard that sentiment and tried to reflect that and try to always reflect this in our advocacy work as well. And so before I pass it to Katisha, we developed the high level recommendations. And they're really presented as a web of interconnected recommendations to enable this transformational change. There was so many recommendations put forth that were really linked to also the climate strategy, but this was really to enable this transformational change at the federal level, like what is needed to improve decision making, ensure decision making. First Nations are part of decision making and leaders in that spaces and have seats at the table and are really part of decision making. But also, if you think about funding and many different elements that are required to make this transformational change to uplift BC First Nations climate leadership, and I'll pass it to Katisha to kind of go through some of those recommendations. Oh, I think you are.
Similar to what we were talking about earlier within the vision. So you start off with a vision, you go towards the guiding principles, and within that, we spoke on various climate justice topics, which you can see around the circle. We have food and water security, the youth. What does that mean? How are we engaging the youth? And most of that was about recommending to bring them out onto the land, do paid internship programs to ensure that youth are being valued for their time and while they're still learning their languages and their cultures through being on the land and engaging with climate adaptation strategies and mechanisms. And when we talk about emergency management, what does that mean going further? Some communities are one road in and out. And mainly their recommendations within the emergency management area was to build more roads to ensure that they have multiple ways to escape fires. There are climate leadership capacity, rights, jurisdiction, natural law, legal orders, protocols, and identity. That was a key highlight within the conversations within the Spiritual Knowledge Keepers gathering is what do our laws say? What do our distinct nations say in terms of how our creation stories are said, the oral history, our actual First Nations laws, jurisdictions, and that was interesting conversation to have sometimes as well within the recommendations because, of course, with this colonial mindset that was imposed upon us through the westernized institutions, we were having conversations about jurisdiction and overlapping jurisdiction that we wouldn't have necessarily had pre-contact, and that was a change. That was an adaptation that was placed upon us that we have to now navigate through. And going forward, we also talked about First Nations led climate planning. And that's much of the work that we're talking about today is the actual planning, the setting of the table, the witnessing work, the listening work, and then like Kristi had said, hearing constantly within every single one of the recommendations is that we need action now. People are so tired of seeing duplicated work. We need to create strategies and ensure that there's actual capacity and infrastructure and long-term sustainable core reliable funding for these initiatives to be set in place. Next slide, please. And that brings me to the reflections and lesson learned. So, speaking on core, reliable, long-term sustainable funding, that is missing. There is such a lack of um, urgency from all levels of government, even within our own First Nations governments. Many of the peoples within the nations that we had visited or that we had heard from, unfortunately, because of this poly crisis that we're living amongst, the climate emergency is never seen as high priority when faced with imminent threats to life. And we were also faced with the short timelines and lack of sufficient budget for the engagement, especially seeing as here in BC we have 204 nations, whereas other regions throughout the Canada have only maybe 2 or 7 First Nations within one of their provinces or territories, making it easier for them to engage, having a larger budget to engage, and they were able to pinpoint and focus more so on distinct nations and properly engage with their peoples because unlike us, they had that time, whereas we are trying our best. And as you'll realize in the work that you are all doing and going to be doing, you have to respect the distinct nations. You have to respect whose lands that you're on. And, with 204 nations, that also means that there's 63 plus languages and various forms of protocols and jurisdictions that you're going to be overlapping. There's also a lack of transparency and misalignment with colonial ways of thinking and working. One of the main things was the timelines, and that was interesting to work around because we were being forced to get this work done before we knew that the interregnum was coming, before we knew that there was going to be a turnover in government. We were rushing to get the memorandum to cabinet table, and I thank BCFN and Kristi and Patricia and Cameron and everybody for doing the work that you had done because it was a lesson learned for a lot of us younger people and just starting out in this work to set that reality. That oftentimes when we do this work, especially with government and those timelines, there's many complexities to that federal machine, but it's a well-oiled machine that does exactly what it's meant to do. So it's about figuring out mechanisms of our own and processes of our own to work within our own timelines to ensure that we have full right to our right to practice self-determination and self-governance over the process of climate adaptation. Next slide, please. Now, of course, we mirror what we see, and that comes from the witnessing. Climate anxiety is real, and I mentioned that right now, at time of adaptation, we have to ensure that we're going back to ceremony. That means something as simple as going for a walk to witness what the earth is doing. You notice in one year that something as small as a dandelion is blooming earlier than what they usually do. And you take note of that. And the way that modern scientists work today, we also have applied sciences that our First Nations knowledge keepers have been using since time immemorial as well. So we recognize that the health of the land is a reflection of the health of the people. And we also understand, and what we've been seeing is that we have to respect our knowledge keepers, our elders, our matriarchs, our youth, our 2S plus peoples, and the way in which we see this world, because we've been raised to adapt and learn and walk in this balance. And it's a funny dance that we do. And there's a lot of amalgamation. There's a lot of code switching that goes along with the two-eyed seeing and being that bridge that gaps the colonial policy with our First Nations worldview. But it's important work, and we will mirror what we see. We will do the dance that the federal government wants us to do, but in the same time, we're actually using our languages within these larger documents. The direct translation, for instance, throughout the What We Heard reports, oftentimes One of the main items that I try to do is use our language in the direct translations and ensure that those English words are put into the documents. And the federal government most likely doesn't understand when I say that I'm a Homo Shleni, but I can put down in a document to say I'm a woman of this land, therefore I am, and therefore we have to work better. And we also understand that the relationships are central to climate action. And that is why we're all here today, right? I mean, we have to build up those relationships. We have to start somewhere. We have to start fresh sometimes, but it's the work that is necessary for our future generations. We are never thinking about ourselves. This is not selfish work. This is selfless work. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Katisha. Yeah, it's definitely so true about relationships. And I did see a few people that I've had the opportunity to work with joining, like Renata in a different project, and Ziomara that was also involved in the engagement session, and Inez. So it's so central to this work, these relationships, and how we can move together, working together. And so the implementation efforts, this is more actually related to the climate strategy and action plan, not to confuse you. BCFN was really leading the First Nations climate leadership agenda, but of course, always working in partnership with the First Nations Climate Leadership, or sorry, a Leadership Council. The acronyms are they're very similar, FNLC and FNCL. But we are working as a collective, the climate portfolio for the FNLC. We're working on many different projects. We sit on a technical working group table with the Climate Action Secretariat, and yeah, and so we do work together, and we're also working at implementing the strategy, and that part of that is building relationships, building connections, breaking silos. But we are working on some specific projects that are related to, a climate governance model and climate funding. And so that was really articulated in the First Nations climate leadership agendas. We need a new model. There needs to be a First Nations led governance model, whether it's a secretariat or how that structure looks. And so there's a discussion paper that was drafted by Harmony Johnson. And it's really kind of articulates some of the options for the governance model, but also climate funding. So it's proposed in the First Nations Climate Leadership Agenda, and this is also articulated in the BC First Nations Climate Strategy and Action Plan, is a climate fund. And so that's having, that access to long-term, secure, stable funding. And so based on First Nations priorities, needs, and realities, and also relieving the burden of applications, relieving the burden of reporting. So it's going to go to the FNLC meeting shortly, and the next steps are coming to kind of seek more feedback and work towards kind of implementing that piece. So there's also the climate capacity assessment, which Katisha will touch on in the next slide. We're working with Great Bear Initiative on that project. We also have, we're scoping and kind of seeking feedback, which we had the chance to meet with Renata and the climate action team at Squamish to kind of, and a few other nations and organizations to look at, what are these tools and guides? We know First Nations led climate action planning is really essential, and that was articulated, various times in engagement sessions. But what are these tools needed? What does it look like? And so we've kind of scoped that out and working to next steps, knowing that there is so many tools and guides and resources out there. But what does that, a culturally centered guide for First Nations in BC look like? And what, how is that articulated where, a team can be a nation can say, we can do this too, and we can do this in-house. And I just want to congratulate the Squamish climate team for their climate legacy strategy and the work on that, because it was just, really excellent. And that kind of informed how other nations and for their leadership on that. So really congratulations to their team. And so we're also looking at First Nations, led kind of climate action curriculum and how not only in elementary but high school, like how can these tools be developed to inform curriculum and to educate youth and children on, what First Nations climate action means. What does climate action mean from a First Nations lens, from a context, many of the things that Katisha's brought up in the Knowledge Keepers gathering. And it's really this holistic view on climate action and that connection and those relationships, as Katisha mentioned before. So we're working on that as well. And we're looking at also kind of a youth project. There's been lots of calls, and Katisha could probably speak to this better than myself, but just that youth need to be uplifted. Youth are the leaders and also future leaders, and we need to work towards, and we have a resolution around a youth council, also providing space for gathering, whether it's a youth mandate or youth strategy. So we're kind of working on scoping what that might look like and need to take direction from strong leaders like Katisha and others to kind of guide our work in that space. So I'll pass it to Katisha.
So, as you can see, one of the goals here is from the First Nations Climate Fund would be to ensure long-term and sustainable climate funding that responds to the unique needs, perspectives, and realities of First Nations communities in BC. And when we talk about responding to the needs of those nations and what Kristi was commenting on briefly there about the youth, it starts off with culture and languages always. It starts off with needing to return us to the lands and the waters and to the relationship with our ancestors. And it takes time to be able to do that. And as we fight right now between recognizing where our own priorities sit as human beings and the multiple levels or the multiple jobs that people have, multiple classes that people are needing to get to, we understand that it's difficult to make that happen. But when there's incentive, when there's proper resources available and also safety, like having the proper cultural competency training for those who are working within organizations was very vital. And that's what I commend the work for the First Nations Leadership Council and all of those that work within those various organizations, is that there is a clear line of respect for what we carry as Kwamokh Mistimukh, as people of the land. We also within this are doing collaborative work in coordination, which is necessary to build on long-term climate capacity within First Nations to effectively respond to the climate emergency. And so outlined within the FNCAP, this involves establishing a council, secretariat, or other governance structures to coordinate and provide technical support to communities and lead implementation of these various strategies. And it's about bringing the work back to the nations, back to you, other organizations and assemblies, and discuss the next steps, but also take those next steps and bring about real action. Next slide, please.
I think that's me, and I'll quickly just add, Katisha, if you don't mind, to this slide, just the capacity assessment. We've heard over and over that capacity is a challenge in communities in terms of climate action. Often it's on the side of a desk, or where does it may fit with emergency management, or it may fit with natural resources. So we kind of identified, and within the climate action or climate strategy and action plan, that there's these disparities among nations and their capacity to respond to the climate crisis, but also participate in provincial climate change decision making. And so it was really important to kind of identify these barriers, needs, and challenges, but also just put forward recommendations as well. So we're working on a report. There was a survey, research, and interviews, and just general, general conversation around kind of what capacity means, which is also reflected in the First Nations Climate Leadership Agenda. So stay tuned for that report. So we know that this is a quote from our BCFN knowledge keeper, Dr. Robert Joseph, and you know, he showed up to the Knowledge Keepers gathering wondering, what he had to offer in terms of climate, because it's often seen in a technical sense. But we know, and it's been really essential to kind of my work, but also the FNLC and many of us, is that, it's really this relational, as Katisha said. It's really the crisis, solving this crisis really doesn't start in, in science, Western science, perhaps. It starts, in our hearts, and relationship building and taking responsibility are needed. Our ancestors knew how to be in relationship with Mother Earth, and they had their ways of doing that, and we must bring that forward. I just really love this quote and the words from Dr. Robert Joseph. So I wanted to share that with you all today. And I'll pass it to Katisha to finish off.
So as I mentioned in the beginning of our presentation, ina ko eletha cha eli thiko mach na ko aichkwalo and not samat mistimoch. Those who are working together work good to one another. And please remember these good feelings that we share with one heart and one mind. That's not just words to me, that is law. And that is how we must do this work. When we look back and to what we had witnessed previously, to the relationships that we have had within various levels of government and organizations, nation to nation, we can amend those missteps by remembering that as law. Work together, treat each other well, and understand and meet each other where we're at, essentially, is a lot of the work that we had been doing in the past couple of years, is meeting each other where you're at. So we raise our hands to those who had done the work to show up in these circles, the ones who have actually created the documents. We raise our hands and uplift and clear the path for all of those who are taking the steps further to continue the work. And we're always here as well. We as human beings oftentimes do our best not to duplicate work, but that's difficult because there are so many initiatives that are going on. And so we're here to also provide that help and that guidance as First Nations peoples. While also recognizing that we go through what we're calling currently consultation stress, consultation burnout. And when we duplicate work, it oftentimes becomes difficult for First Nations to show up authentically. And if there's something out there that already exists and we're bringing it to nations, we did our best to ensure that we weren't asking the same questions, that we were showing up with the full intent of sitting there and sometimes just allowing the nations to take lead. And actually, every single time we did an engagement, it seemed as though we were allowing the nations to take the lead and bring the conversation to wherever it was that they needed it to go. We did not want to go in there with a very strict plan. A lot of it was, we sit down in circle, we provide the information that we already have, and then it was beautiful to see the healing that actually occurred in those circles and in those spaces. And I'm excited for the work that is going to be done within your organization. I'm excited to see and have our paths cross time and time again. And again, when you return back to your homes, I hope that your fire is lit in the same way that you had left it. And I also thank your families. I thank your families and your friends, your children, and your homelands for sharing you with us. Haichka, thank you.
Thank you, Katisha and Kristi, for sharing your time, your energy, the effort to put this presentation together and share your learnings with us from all the listening that you have been doing and all of the knowledge that you hold and sharing that generously with us. I really, really appreciate it. I know that this is not a small ask to amongst all the things that all the priorities that you have. And I'm really grateful that we were able to bring this forward to the collaborative, that in this 3-year runway that we have to try to do something meaningful together. And I see so many alignments. I was really grateful to listen to this again and again and kind of see how we can weave together, and look forward to that relationship continuing to have your guidance on really bringing this in a meaningful way forward. There are a couple of questions in the chat, and we have about 20 minutes together still. I'm going to put us in the gallery view so that we can see each other. Feel free to unmute and introduce yourself and share your questions. And yeah, we can have a little bit of a conversation time.
I do see a question from Ian in the chat. I can respond to that. It was around, the significant amount, proportion of First Nations living in urban settings. Were there efforts to specifically engage with urban First Nations and/or certain recommendations to specific populations? I would say this is an important point. I know Katisha maybe also to speak to this with Katisha's involvement with the urban youth. I'm trying to think of the organization, but maybe you can speak to that briefly before I can add on.
Let me see. Yeah, it's the Urban Native Youth Association. And so for us, we actually provide more of the services towards youth who have come to live within the city. And we don't do much work, honestly, on climate adaptation or working surrounding with the climate emergency. We do some gardening with the youth, but a lot of it, for instance, we have the youth council that had started in the past couple of months. And like I mentioned, much in the same way that we engaged with the nations, the way that we go about the work at Anya is to ensure that we aren't telling the youth what they need. We aren't being prescriptive. We allow them to tell us what they want to do and do everything possible to ensure that their home cultures are being respected while also respecting the cultures of the lands that they're on. And that's important too, is bringing in the host nations and sharing of those cultures and those medicines. For instance, something as simple as our medicines, which are actually very complex. We have the cedar here on the Coast Salish territories, but then our relatives oftentimes have their sage in their bundles. And when we go into spaces, our protocol tells us to trade. So we trade in those medicines. And for me, that practice of trading is also law. And when we go into these spaces of engagement and ensuring that we're building up those relationships, we're not just trading the medicines as a physical object. We can also move forward from that and learn from it and mirror those actions and trade and be reciprocal in the knowledge transfer. So it's going into a space, figuring out what you can take, but also what you can leave.
Thanks,
And
Katisha.
of
Oh,
course,
sorry.
it's okay. And my apologies, everybody. I have been called into a meeting with the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, so I have to go. It's been wonderful, and I extend my heart and my energy out to all of you in hopes that we could have our paths cross again. And thank you so much for listening and sharing and being curious.
Thank you, Katisha. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
rest of your day. Thank you
Thank
for
you,
Thanks,
Katisha.
Katisha. Yeah, I'll just speak to Ian's question briefly. So we didn't have targeted engagements for urban First Nations particularly, but we hope to capture kind of, in the locations we had, given the timelines and the budget. We're invited to have, many people traveled from many different directions as well to, different parts of the province to come to the engagements. So, for example, we had Prince George, we did have one in the Lower Mainland, and so we did have First Nations from not necessarily from, the nation right where we hosted it. They were coming from also urban contexts, but also different rural areas, because sometimes it's easier to fly to Vancouver from, different rural First Nations as well. So we tried to kind of have a mix of, engagements that we could kind of, capture the most feedback and viewpoints. But I think it is definitely a good point, and I think it would have been beneficial to also, maybe host, a lot of the meetings are in Vancouver, so we did try to kind of spread them out regionally, to, for example, very rarely are there engagements in Cranbrook or Fort St. John. So people really appreciated us kind of traveling to the different language groups and regions. And in particular, the recommendations, I think, really are targeted to benefit all First Nations. But of course, um, I think I wouldn't say there's any specifically for urban First Nations, but there are related to youth, which would be applicable to urban youth as well. So I think, yeah, and we will have the final draft report coming up in the next month. It's just being graphic design, so it's been endorsed, and we're just kind of wrapping up that so we can share it back with this group. We also have an engagement summary, which I can share a link in the chat as well. And so it's a summary of each session and kind of what we heard from the participants. I do see another question from Marina, and then maybe, yeah,
I
so
think the
it was
general
about an
engagement,
example.
yeah, the regional engagement sessions, I think Katisha did share, and the Marina's question is actually related to that. So yeah, go ahead and
Okay.
have
Okay.
anything to add to that to that report if you want to give anything supplementary in terms of, maybe what were the recommendations that were in the memorandum to the cabinet too, like if there's any specifics that you brought forward, if there's anything that you can share, I think it'd be useful.
Yeah, for sure. So in the report, there is we have 11 themes, which were in that diagram, but then under each theme, there is sub recommendations. So, for example, around capacity, which is theme 2, there's really one of the recommendations, the sub recommendations is support the development and implementation of a BC First Nations Climate Secretariat, and that's speaking to the governance structure that may, uplift this First Nations-led climate action. And recommendation 2.2 is around funding and supporting the creation of climate positions and a provincial First Nation-led climate network. And recommendations 2.3 is really that coordinated and meaningful engagement and co-development approaches. So so each thematic kind of, each theme of the 13 have sub recommendations. So I really invite each of you to kind of look through the report, but it's also really high level for transformational change at the federal level, but of course applicable to provincial level as well. Yeah, so I invite you to each kind of review the report, and also just wanted to note that the memorandum to cabinet was developed by the federal government, which was a quite a tough point after First Nations leads from across Canada worked on these recommendations. We collaborated. We were just given kind of a high level presentation of kind of what went into the memorandum to cabinet, but really didn't have feedback on what went to decision makers, which it didn't ultimately land on the decision making table in cabinet with, all the political uncertainty and with Trudeau stepping down, etc. So unfortunately, that was a big sticking point. Is the memorandum to cabinet process it's not a transparent process. It's very secretive. And so that was kind of a big friction point in that process. So just wanted to highlight that.
Thank you, Kristi.
Is it
I
Raphael?
think the report you were referring
Sorry.
to with the recommendations is not the same one that Katisha pasted. The one Katisha pasted is broken down by the language groups and what we heard and what was heard in the engagements. So
Yeah, that's basically just a summary of the engagements, and then there isn't recommendations, and that would be just the summary, like a what we heard report from the engagements, and then the final report that is not public yet. There's a
right.
draft actually on our events page that I could share that's pretty similar to this draft, but I might just wait to send final version. So yeah, we just know that it's very important to report back when First Nations come to engagements and to participate and share knowledge and wisdom. It's super important to kind of continue the dialogue and follow up on implementation as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. Raf, floor is yours.
Thanks. I heard a couple times referring to accountability mechanisms. I was wondering if you could flesh that out a little bit further, both in terms of what came out of it, but also internally or maybe at a smaller scale of local governments here, what any lessons learned that we can run with.
Good question. Thank you. Yeah, it was definitely brought up quite a bit kind of nationally on like, what are the internal mechanisms that that can hold federal government to account to also make the changes within their respective federal ministries, to break the silos within themselves, but also to reform program delivery. There's hundreds of programs. So what are ways that the federal government can create mechanisms internally to reduce those silos, to ensure collaboration, to, also take this initiative. And so I wouldn't say we kind of develop specific mechanisms that would work, but I think, trilateral, like having a trilateral table was definitely brought up. And so we are working in BC to develop a terms of reference to have a trilateral table. We sit bilaterally with the provincial government, but many across Canada, we need to work trilaterally. It needs to be First Nations at the table with the federal and provincial government to break these silos and to hold government accountable. And so whether that's kind of one example, but also is to, think of the programs and how those are rolled out to increase efficiencies, the hundreds of programs. For example, in BC, just alone in low carbon transportation, there's hundreds of programs, and navigating these programs are complex. And so it's also taking ownership within government to say we can make systemic changes, and we can also develop kind of these mechanisms internally to make things, better, processes smoother, to break those silos, build relationships. So I don't know if that fully answers your questions. Like in the report, we kind of, have that need for these mechanisms, but I think it would be on a depending kind of yeah, on what the topic is, or yeah, what the recommendation is or what's needed for the change. But I think it's just saying that the government also needs to take ownership that there needs to be change, essentially. But I think with like local governments I think there's really a big opportunity to build relationships, but also, collaborate as well. And I think maybe that's the missing piece from the trilateral. This was really focused, but maybe there's an opportunity to have local municipal governments at the table as well. So
Yeah, if I can just follow up on that, on the relationship piece, a lot of us are civil servants in a box professionally. And there's specific channels and avenues and mechanisms to engage with First Nations. Do you have you seen, or do you have any advice for those of us that exist within these worlds on how to create some space for relationship building, knowing that our communication channels are quite structured and oftentimes outside of our control?
yeah, and maybe I would ask Colin Ziomara to also, I know Ziomara works directly with nations on the coast and was really part of these engagements. But I think what I've really learned is kind of that space to create relationship, like the informal spaces. So as a local government, maybe there's ways to kind of build that relationship more informally, because it is often, letters being sent to nations, and nations are often bombarded with, there's a lot coming at them. And so it's really tricky to get response. And it's not that necessarily, maybe they don't care, but it's also like building more spaces where there's gatherings and sharing meals and getting to know each other in different contexts, which is not always easy within, more structured government, processes. So, and yeah, it is a tricky question, but I think it's time, and it's also that continuity of staff too. And I think that's tricky when there's often staff turnover. It can be hard, and that we've even seen that, provincially when staff turns over. We've built this relationship for a few years. We've been really working together, and then a new staff member comes in and you have to start fresh. So and that can also happen within nations when, there's elections and things change. So that's also very, very complex to navigate. And I know I see Xiomara is unmuted, so I'd just like to invite Xiomara as well to share.
I'm so grateful for your question. This is so important. And I think your question is key to the future of this work. When we collaborate and we see with curiosity and intention to the other or to other groups, like in your case, you're open to figure out ways on how to do it. I think something good, we're doing something good today. Today is a day to celebrate because outside First Nations communities, we think about progress and go achieve all the goals that we have, but often we're not thinking about the impacts on small communities. We don't think about the impact necessarily on the environment or on the families that live in certain areas. So when we combine two worlds, say First Nations and non-First Nations organizations or groups or agencies, then we have a vision that is way more bigger. You know what I'm saying? When our values as people of the land and people from the city, I'm gonna say, when they connect, then we can work in a way that is way more efficient and more sustainable. Now, going back to your question, I think it's so key because whenever we share spaces, when we go to events, when we're talking about climate resiliency or climate adaptation, then I think part of being in person is to try to sit next to the person perhaps that we know the least and try to make those connections and to build that understanding. Right? So I believe that connections and going through those events and taking those opportunities and starting to know each other is so super important. So maybe this space could be a space where we share those opportunities to sit together and start a path walking together. Thank you.
I see there's a poll up, which is exciting. I haven't done one of those in a while, so maybe I'll let
I see I was double muted, so you couldn't hear me as I was saying that. We have a few more minutes together, and a wonderful question because it kind of started the hands going up with Dave and Ian also putting their hands up. And the poll is just to kind of invite you to give feedback on the session, and you can move the window of it to the side so that you can still see all the faces after you responded, but we'll leave that open in the background for you to answer. I think we might have time for one more question, hopefully get to both. We'll see. Dave, go ahead.
You know what? Actually, I'm gonna lower my hand. I'll defer to Ian.
Dave, I've already asked a question, so please go ahead.
Well, I don't really have a question. I had a comment on something that was previous. So if you have a question, go ahead.
Mine was kind of a comment as well.
I'd be interested to hear both your comments.
Well,
So
all I was going to say was in relation to Raphael's question was that our group, I'm with the Climate Action Secretariat. We run the local government climate action program, which includes the 8 modern treaty nations. And after the first 2 years of the program, it was painfully obvious that, sending emails and letters and inviting to group webinars and stuff was not the best way to develop a relationship. It didn't do that at all. And so we simply took the approach of, obviously, we would love to have been able to travel to the communities ourselves, but I simply picked up the phone and called people with no agenda. I just said, let's take 30 minutes and say hi to each other. And in every single case, that 30-minute call lasted an hour or longer. And I just asked questions about, we introduced ourselves and who we are. And I asked about their communities because I don't know all the communities. And next thing you know, an hour had gone by and a whole bunch of information got shared. And now I feel pretty comfortable being able to pick up the phone and call this person and say, hey, here's a question or whatever. And yeah, I just found it so much better than trying to have some sort of set agenda and specific questions. We have to answer these right now. It's not rocket science, but yeah, government's not good at doing that.
Thanks, Dave. And maybe we'll pass it over to Ian. I completely agree. Like, I think it was hard with the Knowledge Keepers gathering. A few, people kept asking, for the agenda. What's the agenda? And we're like, there's no agenda. And it really it's very freeing to provide that space and to also learn to sit and listen as well has been really important. But no, really appreciate that. And we often find too, picking up the phone is one of the best ways to reach the nations or, building relationships. And for example, Ziamara, we got a chance to meet each other we were in Haida Gwaii together and we've had time to spend, and talk about our families and our lives. And you just build that foundation, right? And so thank you for your comment, Dave. And we'll pass it over to Ian. I see we have 1 minute and I know how busy everyone is.
Yeah, I'll keep it quick. Thanks. Raphael, I really appreciated your question and like just that tension of trying to be open but not overwhelming people it's really tricky. With us in Squamish Nation, we've established a quarterly meeting, but we were lucky in that our plans came to fruition at the same time, so we were able to kind of use that nexus as a way forward. But that was a cool opportunity. Yeah, one final comment to Inez and the rest of the ICLEI group. Inez, you were talking about how much this work had resonated with you, and I just compliment you in that I feel like you've brought a lot of the ideas into this group, that coming as you are and not coming forth with your own agenda. A lot of what the speaker said, I've seen reflected in this group. So yeah, I was really impressed with that. Thank you.
Everybody, this was a very rich session, and thank you for your participation. Looking forward to continuing our conversations. And speaking of relations, the next time we get together, it'll be in person. So looking forward to seeing many of you on June 25th in person. Kristi, invite is always open to you. I know you're far away, and but anytime that you want to join, there is space at the table. Thank you so much,
everyone. Thanks for the space, and anytime you have our emails, we can follow up with the presentation as well. And we have our colleagues Cameron Spooner and Harmony and Patricia from BCFN, Harmony's from the First Nations Summit as well, very available to discuss more about the climate strategy and build those relationships as well. So thank you for the opportunity and really appreciate you all coming together in this space. So thank you.
An amazing group. Thank you, Kristi. And yeah, if you are open to sharing a copy of your presentation, we would love to do that.
Definitely send it over, and we'll make sure to follow up with the final report as well, the FNCL agenda report.
Looking forward to it. Yes. Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was beautiful.
Thank you, Xiomara. Thank you for connecting.
Xiomara.